Have you ever felt invisible? Like people look right through you, judging you before you even open your mouth? What if the person cleaning your office, the one you barely acknowledge, was actually your boss? Imagine the shock, the regret, the sheer disbelief when that same person, the one you mistreated, suddenly holds your career in their hands. This is a story about just that. A story about power, prejudice, and the price of disrespect. It's about a CEO who decided to walk a mile in his employees' shoes, only to discover they weren't walking in any shoes of their own, but stomping all over his values. And effective immediately, the deep voice echoed through the stunned office. Your services are no longer required at Benjamin Real Estate. A gasp rippled through the room. All eyes were glued to Mr. Benjamin, the CEO, his face unreadable as he stood tall and resolute. But just moments before, he was someone else entirely. Someone insignificant. Someone easily dismissed. He was the janitor. But how did we get here? How did a simple undercover mission turn into a firing spree? To understand that, we need to rewind back to the beginning, before the mop buckets and the name tag that read Mike. Altman Benjamin was the embodiment of the American dream. He was the founder and CEO of Benjamin Real Estate, a booming company that dominated the city's property market. Altman, a black man, had built his empire from the ground up, fueled by grit, intelligence, and an unwavering belief in fairness and hard work. He was known for his sharp business acumen, but also for his commitment to creating a respectful and inclusive workplace. Or so he thought. Lately, however, a nagging feeling had been growing in Altman's gut. He was hearing whispers, rumors filtering back to him through the grapevine. Employees felt undervalued, disrespected. There were murmurs of a toxic work environment, especially for the junior staff and those in support roles. Altman had always prided himself on being approachable, but the higher he climbed, the more distant he felt from the day-to-day realities of his company. He was in boardrooms, closing deals, strategizing growth, but was he truly seeing what was happening on the ground floor? I need to reconnect, he mused one evening, staring out at the city lights from his penthouse office. I need to see Benjamin Real Estate through fresh eyes, the eyes of someone just starting out. That's when the idea struck him. Undercover. He would go undercover as a janitor. It was the perfect disguise, the ultimate way to become invisible, to observe his company without anyone knowing who he really was. He called his trusted executive assistant, Sarah Chin, a bright and discreet woman who had been with him since the early days. Sarah, I need your help with something unconventional, he began, laying out his plan. Sarah, initially surprised, quickly grasped the brilliance of the idea. She was instrumental in setting everything up. A believable backstory was created for Mike, the new janitor. Old clothes were sourced, a subtle disguise was arranged. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to make him unrecognizable to those who only saw him in a suit and tie. The day arrived. Altman, now Mike, walked into the Benjamin Real Estate building, not through the executive entrance but the service door. He wore a slightly worn janitor uniform, his posture a little hunched, his usual confident stride replaced with a more unassuming shuffle. He felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. This was it. He was about to step into a world within his own world, a world he had unknowingly created but no longer truly understood. His first day as Mike was revealing. People barely made eye contact. Instructions were barked at him, not spoken. He was asked to clean up messes that weren't his, and then ignored when he asked for basic supplies. He felt the sting of invisibility, the subtle but constant condescension. It was eye-opening but also manageable. He was prepared for some level of discomfort. What he wasn't prepared for was the blatant disrespect, the casual cruelty, and the undercurrent of something darker that he began to sense in the air. As Mike emptied trash cans on the third floor, he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. It was coming from the marketing department, a group known for their high energy and creative campaigns. He paused, pretending to dust a nearby plant, his ears straining to catch the words. It was Jessica, the head of marketing, speaking, her voice laced with disdain. Did you see that new janitor? Honestly, where do they find these people? She sneered. A chorus of giggles followed. Mark, a senior marketing executive, chimed in, probably dragged him off the street. Looks like he hasn't smiled in years. Jessica laughed louder. Well, at least he's good for something, right? Someone has to clean up after us. Altman's blood ran cold. He knew Jessica and Mark. He had personally hired them, believing in their talent and their supposed company spirit. To hear them speak about him, or rather Mike, with such callous disregard, it was a punch to the gut. But it was just the beginning. As the day wore on, Altman witnessed more. Snide remarks, dismissive gestures, and a general air of superiority from the higher-ups towards the support staff. It wasn't just him. He saw other janitorial staff, the security guards, the mailroom clerks, all treated as if they were less than human, barely acknowledged, their presence tolerated but not valued. The final straw came late in the afternoon. He was cleaning the executive washroom on the top floor when he heard voices again. This time it was coming from inside one of the stalls. He recognized the voice of David Miller, his VP of sales, a man who projected an image of polished professionalism. David was on a call, his tone arrogant and dismissive. "No, I don't care if it's inconvenient for them. They're just admin staff, they'll figure it out. We're the sales team, we bring in the money. They should be grateful for whatever scraps we throw their way." David chuckled, a cold, self-satisfied sound that echoed in the sterile bathroom. "Honestly, sometimes I think we should just replace them all with robots. Cheaper and definitely less demanding." Altman clenched his fists, his mop handle creaking under the pressure. Robots? Scraps? This was his company they were talking about, his people. The people he believed he was leading with fairness and respect. The reality was a stark, brutal contrast to the image in his head. The whispers he had heard were not just rumors, they were the tip of a very ugly iceberg. And he, Altman Benjamin, had been completely blind to it. That night, Altman barely slept. He replayed the day's events in his mind, each incident a fresh wave of anger and disappointment. He thought about his own journey, the struggles he had overcome, the importance of respect and dignity he had always championed. And here, in his own company, these very values were being trampled upon. He couldn't ignore it. He wouldn't ignore it. Something had to be done. And it had to be done decisively. The next morning, Altman Benjamin walked into Benjamin Real Estate, not as Mike the janitor, but as Altman Benjamin, the CEO. He was dressed in his power suit, his face set in a grim expression. He strode directly to Sarah Chen's office. "Sarah, assemble everyone. All department heads, senior executives, marketing, sales, admin, everyone in a leadership position. In the main conference room." "No." Sarah, sensing the gravity in his voice, didn't hesitate. Within minutes, the conference room was packed, a nervous buzz filling the air. They had never been summoned like this before, not without warning, not with this sense of urgency. Altman entered the room, his presence instantly silencing the chatter. He stood at the head of the long table, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his leadership team. Jessica, Mark, David. They were all there, looking expectant, perhaps a little confused. Altman took a deep breath, his voice resonating in the suddenly silent room. "Good morning," he began, his tone dangerously calm. "Yesterday, I learned something very important about Benjamin Real Estate. Something disturbing." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I learned that somewhere along the way we have lost our way. We have forgotten the basic principles of respect, of dignity, of common decency." He continued, his voice hardening. "Yesterday I was not your CEO. Yesterday I was one of the people you looked down upon. Yesterday I was the janitor." A collective gasp filled the room. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open. Jessica choked on her coffee. Mark's face paled. David Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They were starting to understand. The blood drained from their faces as realization dawned. Altman held their gaze, his expression unwavering. "And what I saw, what I heard, it was unacceptable. It was appalling. It was a betrayal of everything I stand for, everything this company is supposed to represent." He paused again, the silence in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Then his voice dropped to a chillingly low register. "Therefore," he declared, his eyes locking onto Jessica's. "Jessica, effective immediately, your services are no longer required at Benjamin Real Estate." A stunned silence descended upon the conference room, broken only by Jessica's sharp intake of breath. Her face, moments before flushed with confusion, now contorted in disbelief and then anger. You can't be serious," she sputtered, her voice trembling with indignation. "You're firing me? Jessica Miller, head of marketing? For what? For some misunderstanding with the janitor?" Altman met her gaze unflinchingly. "It's not a misunderstanding, Jessica. It's about respect. Or rather, the lack of it. I heard you, Jessica. I heard the way you spoke about the new janitor and, by extension, about everyone in a similar role. That kind of condescending attitude has no place in this company." Jessica scoffed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "Condescending? Please. It was a joke. A harmless joke. Are you really firing me over a joke?" She looked around the room, appealing to her colleagues for support, but found only averted eyes and uncomfortable shuffling. No one dared to meet Altman's intense gaze. It wasn't a joke, Jessica, Altman said, his voice firm but controlled. It was a reflection of a deeply ingrained attitude, an attitude that devalues people based on their job title, their perceived status. And it's not just you, is it? He turned his attention to Mark, who was now visibly sweating, his usual confident smirk replaced with a nervous twitch. Mark, I believe you also had some insightful comments about the new janitor's appearance? Mark stammered, trying to backpedal. Mr. Benjamin, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just office banter. We were just letting off steam. Steam? Altman repeated, a hint of steel in his voice. By making fun of someone you perceive as beneath you? Is that how we let off steam at Benjamin Real Estate now? He shook his head, a deep disappointment etched on his face. And David, he said, turning to his VP of Sales, David Miller, whose earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a sickly pallor. David, I was particularly enlightened by your views on admin staff and your aspirations to replace them with robots. Fascinating perspective on human capital, especially coming from the VP of Sales. David opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but no words came out. He simply stared at Altman, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He knew Altman had heard him. He knew his casual cruelty, spoken in the supposed privacy of a bathroom stall, had just cost him everything. Altman didn't prolong the agony. He had made his point. He had shown them in the most dramatic way possible that their behavior was unacceptable. Mark, he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence, consider yourself relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Mark's face crumpled. He looked like he was about to argue, to plead, but the look in Altman's eyes stopped him. He knew it was over. Then Altman turned to David. David, he said, his voice colder than ice, I believe you need more time to contemplate the value of human beings versus robots. Therefore, your employment at Benjamin Real Estate is also terminated, effective immediately. David Miller finally found his voice, but it was a choked whisper. Mr. Benjamin. Altman. Please, you're making a mistake. We didn't realize, we'll change. We promise. Give us another chance. He was practically begging now, his polished veneer completely shattered. Altman remained unmoved. Chance? He repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. You had your chance. Every day you came to work, you had a chance to treat everyone with respect. You chose not to. Now you face the consequences. He gestured towards the door. Security will escort you out. Please clear your desks and leave the premises immediately. The conference room was in chaos. Jessica, Mark, and David, the once powerful leaders, were now being led out, their careers in tatters, their faces a mask of shock, anger, and dawning regret. The remaining staff watched in stunned silence, a mixture of fear, awe, and perhaps a flicker of something else, hope? As the fired executives were led away, Altman turned to the remaining department heads and senior staff. His gaze was no longer cold but intense, searching. This is not a witch hunt, he said, his voice regaining some of its usual warmth, but still carrying a serious undertone. This is a course correction. I'm not firing everyone who has ever made a mistake. But I am drawing a line. Disrespect, condescension, prejudice, these have no place at Benjamin Real Estate. We are a team. Every single person in this company, from the CEO to the janitor, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. He paused, letting his words sink in. I went undercover to understand what was really happening here. And what I found, it broke my heart. But it also strengthened my resolve. We are going to rebuild this company culture. We are going to create a workplace where everyone feels valued, respected, and empowered. And it starts now. He announced immediate mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, starting next week. He also promised to implement anonymous feedback channels, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their position, could voice their concerns without fear of reprisal. He spoke passionately about his vision for Benjamin Real Estate, a vision where success was not just measured in profits, but in the well-being and respect of every employee. The initial shock began to give way to a sense of cautious optimism. Some of the department heads nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a newfound understanding. Others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Altman knew this was just the beginning. Firing 3 senior executives was a dramatic first step, but true change would require more than just a few swift dismissals. It would require a fundamental shift in mindset, a deep cultural transformation. And that, he knew, would be a long and arduous journey. Later that day, Altman found himself back in his penthouse office, the city lights twinkling below. He felt a strange mix of emotions, a sense of grim satisfaction at having taken decisive action, but also a heavy weight of sadness and disappointment. He had built this company, poured his heart and soul into it, and yet, it had become a breeding ground for the very attitudes he despised. He wondered how deep the rot went, how many more people harbored similar prejudices, how much work it would take to truly cleanse the company culture. As he pondered these questions, Sarah Chin knocked softly on his door. She entered, her face a mixture of concern and admiration. "Mr. Benjamin," she began, "the news is spreading fast. People are talking. Some are praising you, calling you a hero. Others are not so happy. There are rumors, whispers of lawsuits, of retaliation." Altman sighed. He had anticipated this. Firing senior executives was never going to be without consequences. "Let them talk, Sarah," he said, his voice weary but resolute. "Let them whisper. Let them even sue. I know I did the right thing. And I am prepared to face whatever comes next." Suddenly his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, then answered it. "Altman Benjamin speaking." A cold, menacing voice came on the line. "Altman Benjamin," the voice hissed, "you just made a very big mistake. Firing Jessica, Mark, and David, they are protected. You will regret this. You will pay for this. Consider this your first and final warning." Then the line went dead. Altman stared at his phone, a chill running down his spine. Protected? Warning? What did it all mean? Who was this person? And what kind of trouble had he just unleashed? He had fired 3 disrespectful employees thinking he was cleaning house, but had he just stepped into something far more dangerous, far more complicated than he could have ever imagined? Altman stood frozen, the phone still in his hand, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. "Protected?" he murmured, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with concern. "Did you hear that? Someone just called, said those executives are protected, warned me to expect retaliation." Sarah's eyes widened. "Protected? By whom? Retaliation? Mr. Benjamin, what's going on?" Altman shook his head, trying to process the cryptic threat. "I don't know, Sarah. But it didn't sound like an empty threat. There was a coldness in that voice, a sense of real menace." He paced his office, his mind racing. Who would protect Jessica, Mark, and David? They were just mid-level executives, albeit well-compensated ones. What kind of protection could they possibly have that would warrant a threatening phone call to the CEO? "Maybe it's just an empty threat, Mr. Benjamin," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it's just someone trying to scare you." "Maybe," Altman conceded, "but I don't think so. There was something unsettling about that call. We need to be careful, Sarah. Very careful." He instructed Sarah to enhance security measures at the office and at his penthouse, just in case. He also asked her to discreetly look into Jessica, Mark, and David's backgrounds, to see if there was anything unusual, any hidden connections that might explain the threat. The rest of the day passed in a tense atmosphere. The news of the firings had indeed spread like wildfire through the company. Whispers and rumors filled the hallways. Some employees were openly supportive of Altman's actions, praising his courage and decisiveness. They saw it as a long overdue reckoning, a necessary step towards creating a more equitable workplace. Others, particularly those closer to the fired executives, were resentful and fearful, worried about the instability and the potential fallout. Altman tried to project an image of calm and control, but inside he was deeply troubled. The phone call had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he had just stirred a hornet's nest, that he had inadvertently stumbled into something dangerous and unknown. That evening Sarah called Altman at home. "Mr. Benjamin, I found something," she said, her voice tight with concern. "About David Miller. It seems his father is, well, he's a retired judge. Judge Robert Miller. A very influential figure in the city." Altman frowned. "A judge? And Judge Miller is known to be connected," Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Connected to some less than reputable people. There have been whispers, rumors for years, about his involvement in certain circles. Nothing ever proven, of course, but..." Altman felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Connected how, Sarah? Be specific." Sarah sighed. "Unofficially, it said he has ties to organized crime. The city's old families, the ones who operate in the shadows. They say he's helped them out in the past, used his position to smooth things over. Organized crime." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Altman thought back to the threatening phone call, the cold, menacing voice. It all started to make a chilling kind of sense. David Miller, VP of Sales, son of a potentially corrupt judge with ties to the underworld. And Altman had just fired him, publicly and humiliatingly. He had not just fired an employee, he had potentially angered a powerful and dangerous family. Sleep was even more elusive that night. Altman tossed and turned, his mind consumed by the implications of Sarah's discovery. He was no stranger to tough business dealings, to high-stakes negotiations, but this was different. This was venturing into a world he knew nothing about, a world where the rules were different, where power was wielded in the shadows, and where consequences could be unpredictable. The next day at work, the atmosphere was even more charged. The training sessions were scheduled to begin next week, and the remaining staff were buzzing with anticipation and anxiety. Altman tried to focus on business as usual, but the threat hung over him like a dark cloud. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. In the afternoon, Sarah rushed into his office, her face pale and shaken. "Mr. Benjamin, something happened. It's Mark Johnson. They found him, in his apartment." "Dead." Altman stared at her, his blood turning to ice. "Dead. Mark? What happened? Was it an accident?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "The police are calling it a suicide. An overdose. They found him, with a note." "Suicide? Mark Johnson? The seemingly confident, often arrogant marketing executive?" It didn't make sense. Altman had seen Mark just yesterday being escorted out of the building, humiliated and angry, yes, but suicidal? It seemed too sudden, too convenient. And the timing, just after the threatening phone call, just after Altman had started digging into David Miller's background, it felt like more than just a coincidence. "A note?" Altman asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What did the note say?" Sarah hesitated, her expression troubled. "I don't know the exact details, Mr. Benjamin. The police are still investigating. But, unofficially, I heard it was an apology. An apology for causing trouble at Benjamin Real Estate. For letting people down. An apology? For office banter? For making fun of the janitor? It was absurd. It was ludicrous. It was a blatant cover-up." Altman felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce. This wasn't suicide. This was a message. A brutal, terrifying message delivered with chilling clarity. They were not just protected. They were untouchable. And they were sending him a warning, a stark reminder of the price of crossing them. Altman slammed his fist on his desk, the sound echoing in the silent office. "This is not suicide, Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "This is murder. They killed him. They killed Mark to scare me. To shut me up." Sarah recoiled, her face ashen. "Mr. Benjamin, are you sure?" "We don't know for certain." "I am sure, Sarah," Altman said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I may not have proof, not yet. But I know it in my gut. This is their way of doing business. This is how they protect their own. And they think they can scare me? They think they can make me back down?" He stood up, his eyes blazing with defiance. "They're wrong. Dead wrong." He picked up the phone, his hand shaking slightly, and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. A number that belonged to someone from his past, someone who knew the city's underbelly, someone who understood the language of the streets, someone who could help him navigate this dangerous new world he had been thrust into. He needed information. He needed allies. He needed to fight back. And he knew exactly who to call. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Mark, it's Altman," Altman said, his voice tight with urgency. "Altman Benjamin." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched on, thick with unspoken history. Then a low chuckle rumbled through the line. Well, Mark drawled, his voice laced with a familiar mix of amusement and caution. "Altman Benjamin. Long time no hear. Last I checked, you were Mr. High and Mighty CO, too busy for the likes of me. Mark, I need your help," Altman cut to the chase, ignoring the jab. "I'm in trouble. Serious trouble." Mark was silent for another beat. "Trouble, huh? What kind of trouble gets a CEO calling a washed-up street hustler like me?" Despite the self-deprecation, there was a keenness in his voice, a hint of interest. "It's complicated," Altman began, briefly outlining the undercover mission, the firings, the threatening phone call, and Mark Johnson's death. He didn't mention the racism aspect directly yet, focusing on the immediate danger. Mark listened in silence, occasionally interjecting with a grunt or a question. When Altman finished, there was a long pause. Then Mark sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound. "Judge Miller's boy, huh? And Mark Johnson, dead? Damn, Altman, you really stepped in it this time. You know Judge Miller?" Altman asked, his voice strained. "Know him?" Mark scoffed. Everyone in this city knows Judge Miller. Or at least they know of him. Man's got fingers in every pie, legal and otherwise. And his family, their old money, old power. Messing with them is like kicking a sleeping bear. Except this bear bites back. Art. Mark was Altman's connection to a past he had long left behind. They had grown up in the same tough neighborhood, navigating the same streets, facing the same prejudices. But while Altman had chosen the path of legitimate business, Mark had walked a different road, one that led him into the city's underbelly. They hadn't spoken in years, their lives diverging sharply, but Altman knew that if anyone could understand the kind of danger he was in, it was Mark. "I need to know more, Mark," Altman said, his voice urgent. "About Judge Miller, about his family, about everything. And I need to know who killed Mark Johnson and why." Mark sighed again. "Altman, you're asking for a whole lot. This ain't some boardroom deal you can negotiate your way out of. This is a different game. A dangerous one." "I know," Altman said, his voice firm. "But I can't back down, Mark. I won't. Not after what I saw, what I heard. And definitely not after what happened to Mark." There was a moment of silence. Then Mark spoke, his voice losing its playful edge, becoming serious, almost grim. "All right, Altman. All right. You always were too stubborn for your own good. Meet me tonight. The old place. You remember?" Altman did remember. The old place was a rundown bar in their old neighborhood, a place they hadn't set foot in for decades. It was a place of ghosts, of memories, both good and bad. But it was also a place where secrets were traded, where information flowed, where men like Mark held court. That night, Altman drove to the old neighborhood, a part of the city he rarely visited anymore. The streets were narrower, the buildings older, the air thick with a different kind of energy, a mix of desperation and resilience. He parked a block away from the bar, a nondescript building with a flickering neon sign that read "The Corner Pocket." He walked the rest of the way, feeling a strange sense of unease, as if stepping back into a forgotten chapter of his life. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, smoky, and smelled of stale beer and something vaguely acrid. A few patrons sat hunched over drinks, their faces etched with hard living. Mark was waiting for him at a corner booth, a large, imposing figure even in the shadows. He had aged, his face more lined, his hair grayer, but his eyes still held that same sharp intelligence, that same streetwise cynicism. "Altman," Mark greeted him, a curt nod his only acknowledgement. He gestured to the seat opposite him. "Sit. Drink?" Altman shook his head. "Just information, Mark. That's all I need." Mark chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Information ain't free, Altman. Especially not the kind you're asking for. But for old time's sake, we'll talk." He signaled to the bartender, a burly man with a shaved head and a wary gaze, and ordered 2 drinks. As they waited, Mark studied Altman, his eyes narrowed. "You look good, Altman. Real good. CO life suits you." "It's not what it seems, Mark," Altman said, his voice low. "It's all surface. Underneath, it's rotten. I thought I was building something good, something fair. But I was wrong. It's all built on this." He gestured around the bar, at the dimly lit space, at the shadows lurking in the corners. "On power, on prejudice, on people like Judge Miller and his son." Mark nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Prejudice, huh? Yeah, that's their game. Always has been. They don't care about fair, Altman. They care about power. And they don't like folks like us getting too much of it." He paused, then added, his voice hardening, "Especially not black folks." The drinks arrived. Mark took a long swig of his, then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Judge Miller? Robert Miller is a bad man, Altman. Real bad. He's been pulling strings in this city for decades. Judges, cops, politicians, he owns them all. And his family, they're even worse. They think they're above the law, above everyone. Especially people like us." He went on to tell Altman about the Miller family, their history, their rumored connections to organized crime, their reputation for ruthlessness. He spoke of whispers of corruption, of intimidation, of violence. He painted a picture of a family that operated outside the normal rules, a family that considered themselves untouchable. "And David? David is his father's son," Mark said, his voice grim. "Spoiled, arrogant, thinks he can get away with anything. He probably didn't order the hit on Johnson directly, but he wouldn't have to. His family has people who handle things like that." Altman listened, his stomach churning. The pieces were falling into place, forming a horrifying picture. He had fired David Miller for disrespect, for casual cruelty, for racism. But he had also inadvertently challenged a powerful, dangerous family, a family that would stop at nothing to protect their own. And now Mark Johnson was dead, a chilling example of their reach and their ruthlessness. What do I do, Mark? Altman asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I fight this? I can't just back down. Not now. Not after everything. Mark looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and respect. Fighting them, Altman? That's like trying to fight the wind. They're too powerful, too connected. You can't win. Then what? Altman demanded, his voice rising in frustration. Just let them get away with it? Let them intimidate me? Let them kill more people? Mark sighed. There are ways, Altman. Ways to fight back without fighting them directly. Ways to expose them, to bring them down, slowly, carefully. But it's going to be dangerous. And it's going to take time. Are you ready for that? Altman looked at Mark, his eyes filled with a grim determination. I have to be, Mark. I have no choice. For Mark, for my company, for myself. I have to fight back. Mark nodded slowly, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his eyes. All right, Altman. All right. Then let's fight. But we're going to do it my way. Quietly. Carefully. In the shadows. Because in this game, Altman, the shadows are where the real power lies. As Mark spoke, a sudden commotion erupted at the bar. The door burst open and two large, menacing-looking men strode in, their eyes scanning the room. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces hard, their expressions cold and predatory. They moved with a purpose, their gaze locking onto Altman and Mark's booth. Mark swore under his breath. Speak of the devil, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Looks like they found us, Altman. Looks like the game just got a whole lot more interesting. The two men moved with a chilling confidence, their eyes like ice as they locked onto Altman and Mark. The bar, moments before buzzing with a low hum of conversation, seemed to fall silent, all eyes drawn to the unfolding drama. Mark didn't flinch, but Altman could feel the tension radiating off him, a coiled spring ready to unleash. Looks like our ride's here, Mark murmured, his voice deceptively calm. Play it cool, Altman. Let me do the talking. He raised a hand in a casual gesture as the two men approached. Gentlemen, Mark said, his voice smooth and easy, to what do we owe the pleasure? The taller of the two men, with a shaved head and a granite jaw, stopped at their booth, his gaze fixed on Mark. Mark Bell, he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Judge Miller sends his regards. He requests your, and Mr. Benjamin's, presence. Immediately. Altman felt a cold dread wash over him. This was it. They were being summoned. Not for a conversation, not for a negotiation. This was a power play, a show of force. Judge Miller was making it clear that he was in control, that Altman was now playing by his rules. Mark leaned back in his seat, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. Well, ain't that hospitable of the judge, he drawled. Sending his personal invitations. Tell the judge, much appreciated, but Mr. Benjamin and I are just catching up. Maybe another time? The granite-jawed man's eyes narrowed, and his partner, shorter but equally menacing, stepped forward, his hand disappearing inside his jacket. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. It was clear this wasn't a request, it was an order. Now, the first man repeated, his voice losing its veneer of politeness, hardening into a command. The judge is not a patient man. Altman knew they had no choice. Resisting would be foolish, potentially suicidal. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in enemy territory. For now they had to play along to find out what Judge Miller wanted, and to buy themselves time to figure out their next move. All right, Mark said, raising his hands in mock surrender. No need to get testy. We were just leaving anyway. Lead the way, gentlemen. He slid out of the booth, smoothly positioning himself between Altman and the two men, a silent shield. Altman followed, his mind racing, trying to anticipate what awaited them. They were led out of the bar and into a waiting black Chevrolet, its windows tinted, its engine idling ominously. The two men flanked them, one getting in the front, the other sliding in beside Altman and Mark in the back. The doors slammed shut, and the Chevrolet pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into the night. The ride was tense and silent. Altman could feel the eyes of the man beside him, cold and watchful. He glanced at Mark, who remained outwardly calm, but Altman could sense the undercurrent of tension in his posture, the subtle clenching of his jaw. They drove for what seemed like an eternity, the city lights blurring past the windows. Finally, the Chevrolet turned off the main road and onto a private drive, winding through manicured lawns and imposing gates. They were entering a different world, a world of wealth and power, far removed from the gritty streets of Mark's neighborhood. The Chevrolet stopped in front of a sprawling mansion, its lights blazing, casting an almost theatrical glow onto the manicured grounds. It was a fortress of privilege, a symbol of the Miller family's untouchable status. Altman felt a surge of anger mixed with a cold sense of foreboding. He was being led into the lion's den. They were escorted inside, through opulent hallways and into a lavish study, filled with dark wood leather furniture, and the heavy scent of old money. Judge Robert Miller sat behind a large mahogany desk, a figure of imposing presence even in his old age. He was a large man, his face stern, his eyes sharp and calculating. David Miller stood beside him, a smug smirk playing on his lips, his earlier fear replaced by an arrogant confidence. Jessica and Mark were also present, looking pale but defiant, standing slightly behind David like loyal lieutenants. Judge Miller gestured for Altman and Mark to sit in the chairs facing his desk. The two men who had escorted them stood guard by the door, their presence a silent reminder of the power dynamics at play. "Mr. Benjamin," Judge Miller began, his voice deep and resonant, laced with a chillingly polite tone. "And Mr. Bell, thank you for joining us. Or should I say, thank you for allowing yourselves to be joined by us." He chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down Altman's spine. "Judge," Altman said, meeting his gaze directly, trying to project an air of calm he didn't fully feel. "To what do we owe this invitation?" Judge Miller steepled his fingers, his eyes boring into Altman. "Let's be frank, Mr. Benjamin. You've been unwise. Firing my son and Ms. Miller and Mr. Johnson. That was a rash decision. A very rash decision. They were disrespectful, Judge," Altman said, his voice firm. "They created a toxic work environment. They deserve to be fired." David Miller scoffed. "Disrespectful? Toxic? Please. We were just having a little fun. These janitors, admin staff, they're there to be managed, not coddled." His voice dripped with condescension, echoing the very attitude Altman had found so abhorrent. Jessica and Mark nodded in agreement, their faces mirroring David's arrogance. Judge Miller held up a hand, silencing his son. "David, please. Let me handle this." He turned back to Altman, his gaze hardening. "Mr. Benjamin, you seem to misunderstand the way things work in this city. People like you, people in support roles, they have their place. And people like my son, like Jessica, like Mark, they have theirs. It's a natural order. You disrupt that order, you create problems." Altman clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Natural order? Is that what you call it? Treating people like they're less than human because of their job or their background. That's not order, Judge. That's prejudice. That's racism." He finally said it, the word hanging heavy in the opulent study. A flicker of something, anger? Surprise? Crossed Judge Miller's face. David, Jessica, and Mark stiffened, their smirks vanishing. The air in the room crackled with tension. Judge Miller leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Racism, Mr. Benjamin? Careful with your words. You're venturing into territory you don't understand. This isn't about race. It's about power. And you, Mr. Benjamin, are playing with fire." "It's always about race," Judge Altman retorted, his voice rising, fueled by years of suppressed anger and frustration. "People like you, people like your son, you've built your power on the backs of people like me, on the backs of people you deem lesser. You think you can just dismiss us, disrespect us, even destroy us and get away with it. But you're wrong. I won't let you." Judge Miller's face darkened, his eyes blazing with fury. "You dare lecture me about race, boy?" He spat, the word laced with venomous contempt. "You think you understand anything about power? You're nothing but a upstart who got lucky. Don't mistake your fleeting success for real power, Mr. Benjamin. Because real power belongs to people like us." The racial slur hung in the air, raw and ugly, a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudice that fueled the Miller family's arrogance. Before Altman could react, Mark moved. In a blur of motion, he was on his feet, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk, the force of the blow rattling the room. "You listen to me, you racist old bastard," Mark roared, his voice shaking with rage. "Altman Benjamin is 10 times the man you'll ever be. He built his empire with his own 2 hands, while you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, cheating and stealing your way to the top. You talk about power? You're just a bully hiding behind your daddy's robes." The 2 guards lunged forward, but Mark was faster. He grabbed Altman's arm, pulling him to his feet. "We're done here, Altman," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. "Let's go. Now." He shoved past the guards, dragging Altman with him, heading for the door. Chaos erupted. Judge Miller roared with fury, David and the others screamed insults, and the guards surged forward, trying to intercept them. But Mark was a force of nature, his street instincts kicking in. He dodged, weaved, and shoved his way through the opulent study, Altman stumbling in his wake. They burst out of the mansion and into the night, sprinting across the manicured lawn, the shouts and threats echoing behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the gates, bursting out onto the deserted road, leaving the fortress of Miller Power behind them. As they ran, Altman gasped, "Mark, what did you do back there? Are you crazy? You just insulted a judge and probably a whole crime family." Mark grinned, a wild, reckless grin that Altman hadn't seen in years. "Crazy? Maybe," he chuckled, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "But sometimes, Altman, you gotta show these racist bastards that they can't just talk to us in any kind of way. Sometimes you gotta stand up and fight. Even when you know you're walking into hell." They kept running, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the world of power and prejudice, heading back into the shadows, where their fight was just beginning. The game had changed. It was no longer just about disrespect and firings. It was now a war. A war against a powerful racist enemy who would stop at nothing to protect their dominance. And Altman Benjamin, the CEO who went undercover as a janitor, was now right in the middle of it, ready to fight for his values, for his company, and for his own survival.